This is Jim Lawson for Bourns Pro Audio. I'm here in the Pro Audio Lab. We're talking today about some applications to support an expanding line of our products. So just some general rules with soldering. I recommend using a soldering iron with a pencil tip because we're going to be working on some small spaces here. So as an example, this would be a pencil tip for a soldering iron that we're going to be using here today. This particular one has a transformer base to it where we can control the temperature. One note of caution: if you're using a soldering iron that does indeed have a transformer base, if you have your guitar or your pick guard which has pickups in it, pickups are magnetic. That transformer is also creating a magnetic field. You want to keep the transformer away from the guitar, away from the pickups, to avoid demagnetizing the pickups. You can actually harm them and render them useless if you're not careful. Temperature of the soldering iron is very important. You want to use a tip or a controller that you can adjust the temperature that keeps the tip around 700 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot enough to melt solder, to get the solderable surfaces hot enough to accept solder. It's not too hot that it would damage components if you stayed a little bit longer than necessary to get the solder to flow. You want to make sure that your soldering station has a sponge, and it doesn't have to be this kind of sponge. It could be a damp cloth, a washcloth, anything that can retain some water. You want to take water and dampen whatever it is you're using here, not so that it's soaked, but just damp. And the whole reason for that is before you solder, you want the tip to be clean. You've got residual solder that's left over, that's oxidized. If you look at this tip right now, it isn't very shiny. Once you wipe the tip, what's happening is you're taking this oxidation off there. Now you can see how shiny that is. And it will then be ready to rock and roll here on our soldering. This is the kind of solder we'll be using today. There are several kinds, many kinds of solder. We recommend using SN63, which is an industry term which means 6337. It's an alloy of, in this case, tin lead solder. This particular solder I have is a RMA flux, which stands for mildly activated rosin flux. And flux is going to help us here by preparing the surface just as you're doing the soldering. It will clean the oxides off of any surface we're soldering. There are other kinds of fluxes. You can use a no-clean flux, which is just a term that says if you use this, the flux will get on the surface while you're soldering, and there's no need to clean it. The RMA flux we're using here today can be cleaned, but not with water or anything like that. We would typically use isopropyl alcohol to clean it off. But the whole point of this is these are electronic component friendly. There are other fluxes called active fluxes. We'd recommend never use active flux on any of our products, frankly, because you have to clean that off, or over the period of time it will damage what you're soldered. And the last thing you need is to be in the middle of a gig playing your guitar and then suddenly it isn't working because the active flux has done something while you've been sleeping. All of Bourns products are RoHS compliant, which means you can use a RoHS solder. You can find the recommendations for the particular type of solder on our website by looking at a data sheet, or actually we've got some technical tips and notes on our data sheet that talk to solder and recommended solder alloys. So we're going to use this SN63 solder. It is fairly small in its diameter, makes things easier to work with that way. And you can buy solder that is actually even as thick around as this. I'd recommend, just because it's easier to work with, something small as this. Same reason as we're using a pencil tip, because we're going to be working in small spaces. This is Jim Lawson for Bourns Pro Audio, wishing you happy playing.